Story number 1. The Ghost of Christmas Night. The Christmas of 1977 was supposed to be perfect. My family, the Smythes, had decided to spend the holiday in our newly inherited home, a sprawling Georgian mansion in the countryside just outside of London. The house had belonged to some distant relative my father had never met, but the inheritance seemed like a blessing. My father, ever the optimist, saw it as the perfect setting for a traditional family Christmas. I was 13 at the time, old enough to sense the tension behind my parents' smiles. My mother had been uneasy about the house since the moment we arrived a week earlier. "It's lovely, of course," she'd said, her voice strained as she looked up at the imposing structure, its weathered stone facade cloaked in ivy. "But doesn't it feel a little cold?" Cold was an understatement. The house was a maze of drafty corridors, creaking floors, and rooms that seemed to swallow light. It had character, my father insisted, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house didn't want us there. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, my mother had filled the dining room with garlands and candles, trying to breathe life into the oppressive space. The table was set with the finest china, and the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and mulled wine. For the first time since we'd arrived, the house felt almost warm. We sat down to dinner around 7. My father carved the turkey with exaggerated pomp. My mother poured glasses of wine, and my younger sister, Clara, babbled excitedly about the presents she hoped to open in the morning. For a moment, felt like any other Christmas. Then the clock stopped. It was an old grandfather clock, standing sentinel in the corner of the room. Its steady tick-tock had been a constant background noise since we'd arrived, a rhythmic reminder of time marching forward. But now, it was silent. The pendulum had frozen mid-swing, the hands stuck at precisely 7:15. "Did it wind down?" my mother asked, her voice unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. My father frowned, rising from his chair to inspect it. "It was working fine earlier." Before he could reach the clock, the candles went out, every single one of them on the table, the mantel, and the sideboards snuffed out simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. Clara screamed, and I felt my mother's hand grip my arm. My father struck a match, the tiny flame illuminating his startled face as he relit the nearest candle. "What on earth?" he muttered, his voice trailing off. The room felt colder, the kind of cold that settles in your bones. My breath puffed out in visible clouds, and I noticed frost forming on the edges of the windows. Then we heard it, a soft, deliberate knock, 3 sharp raps, echoing through the house. My father turned toward the sound, his face pale. "Who would be out in this weather?" he asked, though none of us had an answer. He grabbed the candle and headed for the front door, my mother close behind him. I stayed in the dining room with Clara, straining to hear what was happening. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever was on the other side was growing impatient. When my father opened the door, there was no one there. The snow outside was untouched, a pristine white blanket that reflected the moonlight. But as my parents stood there, looking out into the silent night, my father noticed something. "Footprints," he said, his voice barely audible. They were faint but unmistakable, 2 parallel lines of footprints leading from the door into the house. My father bent down to examine them, brushing his fingers against the wet marks on the hardwood floor. "Someone came inside," he said, standing abruptly. He looked down the hallway, his candle casting long, flickering shadows. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. "Who's there?" No answer. The footprints led from the door into the dining room. My mother gasped as they stopped abruptly, right in the middle of the room. It was as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply disappeared. "I don't like this," she whispered, clutching my father's arm. "We should leave." Before he could respond, the clock chimed. His frozen hands had sprung back to life, the pendulum swinging wildly. The sound was deafening, each chime reverberating through the house like a thunderclap. Clara began to cry, and I felt my own terror bubbling to the surface. The fire in the hearth flared suddenly, the flames roaring to life with unnatural intensity. And then we saw him. He stood near the fireplace, a translucent figure dressed in 19th century clothing, a long coat, high boots, and a cravat. His face was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes sunken and hollow. He stared at us, unmoving, his expression a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Who are you?" my father demanded, his voice shaking. The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. When he spoke, his voice was low and mournful, like the rustling of dead leaves. "This is my home," he said. "Why have you come?" The room grew colder still, the frost creeping across the walls. The candles flickered violently before extinguishing again, leaving us in near darkness. The only light came from the fire, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. "You need to leave," the figure said, his voice echoing unnaturally. My father tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The figure took a step closer, and the temperature dropped further. I could see my breath in the dim light, each exhalation a small cloud of fear. "This is my home," the figure repeated, his tone now tinged with anger. "Leave before it's too late." The fire roared again, and the figure vanished. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting slightly. My father wasted no time. "Get your coats," he said, his voice firm. "We're leaving." We spent the night at a nearby inn, huddled together in a single room. None of us spoke about what had happened, but the fear lingered, unspoken and undeniable. The next day, my father contacted a local historian, hoping to make sense of what we'd seen. What he learned chilled us to the core. The house had once belonged to a man named Charles Henshaw, a recluse who had lived and died there over a century earlier. He had been found dead in the dining room on Christmas Eve, 1847, seated by the fire with an untouched plate of food in front of him. The townspeople said he died of a broken heart, though no one knew why. We never returned to the house. My father sold it the following year, and we moved back to London. But I've never forgotten the ghostly figure who appeared that night, his sorrowful eyes burning into my memory. Every Christmas Eve, I find myself thinking of him, the lonely man who couldn't let go of his home, even in death. And I wonder if he's still there, pacing the dining room, waiting for a family to join him by the fire. Story number 2. A silent night in Covina. Christmas in Covina always felt magical to me. Our neighborhood seemed to shine brighter than the rest of California during the holidays, with houses wrapped in twinkling lights and the scent of pine trees wafting through the crisp evening air. But the Christmas of 2008 is burned into my memory for a very different reason. That year, the quiet suburban joy was ripped apart by a nightmare that would haunt us all forever. I lived 3 houses down from the Ortegas on East Knollcrest Drive. They were a large, lively family, the kind that brought life to the street with their warmth and laughter. Every Christmas Eve, they held a grand celebration, and you could hear the hum of their joy even from blocks away. That year, I hadn't planned on joining. I was nursing my own broken heart, fresh from a failed engagement, and the last thing I wanted was to fake smiles at someone else's happy gathering. It was a choice that saved my life but left me forever questioning if I could have done something, anything, to stop what came next. Started like any other Christmas Eve. I was home alone, sipping a glass of wine and absent-mindedly watching A Christmas Carol on TV. Outside, the distant sound of carolers echoed through the night, mingling with the Ortegas laughter that drifted through the cold air. I thought about calling it an early night, but just as I rose to turn off the lights, a loud pop broke the tranquility. First, I thought it was fireworks. It wasn't unusual for someone to set off a few early. But then came another pop, and another, this time louder, sharper. My stomach twisted. Those weren't fireworks. I walked to my front window, peeking out at the street. The Ortega's house was ablaze with lights, their decorations glittering in the darkness. But something was off. The laughter had stopped, replaced by muffled screams. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was dressed as Santa Claus. At first, it almost felt absurd, like something out of a surreal dream. A man in a bright red suit, white fur trim, and black boots, standing in the front yard of the Ortega's house. But the sack slung over his shoulder wasn't filled with toys. And when he raised his arm, I saw the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. I ducked back behind the curtain, heart hammering in my chest. The screams inside the Ortega house grew louder, and I heard the sound of shattering glass. Adrenaline surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone to call 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. When the operator answered, I could barely form the words. "There's a man," I stammered, my voice cracking. "He's in a Santa suit. He has a gun. He's at my neighbor's house. He's shooting." Before I could finish, an explosion rocked the air, rattling my windows. I peeked through the curtain again and saw the Ortega house engulfed in flames. Fire roared from the windows, licking up the walls and casting an orange glow against the night sky. The screams had stopped. I stayed on the phone with the operator, my voice a trembling whisper as I described what I could see. But the man in the Santa suit was gone. He had vanished into the night, leaving only chaos in his wake. By the time the police and fire trucks arrived, the house was a smoldering inferno. Neighbors gathered on the street, their faces pale with shock and horror. We watched helplessly as firefighters battled the blaze, their silhouettes flickering against the fiery backdrop. Some of us prayed that anyone, might have survived. They found 9 bodies in the wreckage. I don't think I'll ever forget the sight of those body bags being carried out, one by one, into the harsh glare of the emergency lights. It was a massacre. Later, we learned that the victims were members of the Ortega family and their guests, all gathered for their annual Christmas Eve celebration. The man in the Santa suit was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. He had once been married to Sylvia Ortega, but their relationship had ended in a bitter divorce earlier that year. Pardo had lost everything in the separation: his wife, his stepchildren, and his finances. What little humanity he had left had been consumed by anger and resentment. That night, dressed as the very symbol of Christmas cheer, he had shown up at the Ortega house armed with a handgun, 2 semi-automatic pistols, and a homemade flamethrower hidden in his Santa sack. He hadn't come to spread joy. He had come to destroy. The details of what happened inside the house that night are too horrific to recount in full. Witnesses later pieced together that Bruce had shot his way through the gathering, sparing no one, not even the children. When his rampage was done, he used the flamethrower to douse the house in gasoline and set it ablaze, erasing everything in a single, fiery stroke. Bruce fled to his brother's house in Sylmar, where he planned to escape, but his plans unraveled. The flames had burned him severely, and the police were closing in. Instead of facing justice, he turned one of his guns on himself, ending his life in a pool of his own blood. The media called it the Covina Christmas Massacre, and for weeks, it dominated every news channel and headline. Reporters flocked to our quiet street, filming the blackened ruins of the Ortega house and interviewing neighbors for sound bites. But no camera could capture the weight of what we felt. We weren't just witnesses to a tragedy. We were survivors of a trauma that would never fully leave us. It's been years now, but East Knollcrest Drive has never been the same. The lot where the Ortega house once stood remains empty, overgrown with weeds and cloaked in silence. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Those of us who stayed rarely speak of that night, as if silence might somehow shield us from its lingering shadows. But the silence doesn't erase the whispers. I started hearing them a few Christmases after the massacre. Late at night, when the world is still and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, I hear voices drifting through the air, laughter, faint and childlike, as if the Ortega children are still playing somewhere just out of sight. Sometimes, I catch the scent of smoke on the breeze, sharp and acrid, though there's no fire to be found. And then there's him. I've seen him twice now, once from my bedroom window, standing in the empty lot where the Ortega house once stood. The figure of a man in a Santa suit, his red coat scorched and blackened, his face hidden in shadow. He doesn't move. He just stands there, staring, as if waiting for something. The second time was on Christmas Eve last year. I was walking home from a neighbor's party, the cold night air biting at my cheeks. As I passed the empty lot, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. When I turned, he was there again, Santa Claus, standing motionless in the darkness, his hollow eyes boring into mine. I didn't stop to look. I ran. Some people say the lot is cursed, that the horror of what happened there left a scar on the land itself. Others think it's just the weight of memory, the way trauma lingers in the mind long after the event has passed. But I know what I've seen. I know what I've heard. Every Christmas, I brace myself for the possibility that he might come back, not as a ghost, but as a shadow of the man he once was, driven by the same hatred that consumed him in life. Of Christmas dinner. Christmas Eve at the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, was supposed to be a night of joy and laughter. It was December 24th, 1995, and I, along with my wife Laura and our closest friends, had planned the perfect evening. The Crescent, with its storied history and stunning Victorian architecture, was famous for its charm and infamous for its hauntings. The legends didn't bother us. Ghost stories were just stories, after all, and the Crescent's reputation only added to the allure. This grand dining hall, decked out in garlands, twinkling lights, and an enormous Christmas tree, was the centerpiece of the hotel that night. The tree, adorned with golden baubles and glowing candles, stood proudly in the corner, exuding an air of timeless elegance. We were a group of 6, seated at a round table near the center of the hall. The room was lively, filled with the chatter of guests and the clinking of silverware. Our waiter, a cheerful young man named Thomas, took our orders with a flourish, promising us a feast fit for the season. Laughter and wine flowed freely, and for a while, felt like we were in our own holiday postcard. But then, as the first course arrived, the atmosphere began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a faint sound, barely audible over the hum of the room. A soft giggle, high-pitched and fleeting. Laura paused, her fork midway to her mouth. "Did you hear that?" she asked, glancing around. "Hear what?" I replied, focusing on my soup. "A child laughing," she said, her brows furrowing. "But there aren't any kids here, are there?" I scanned the room. She was right, this was an upscale dinner. Not the kind of event families brought their children to. "Probably someone from the kitchen," I said dismissively, though a chill prickled at the back of my neck. The giggles continued, growing louder and more distinct as the evening went on. By the time the main course arrived, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just laughter now. There were faint whispers, too, like children playing hide and seek. Every time we turned to look, there was nothing, just the flicker of candlelight and the rustle of tablecloths. Laura leaned in close, her voice low. "It's coming from near the tree," she said, nodding toward the Christmas tree in the corner. I followed her gaze. The tree stood tall and silent, its decorations shimmering softly in the candlelight. But as I stared, I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow darting behind the trunk, quick and fleeting. My breath caught, and I shook my head, chalking it up to the wine. The laughter and whispers continued, unnerving everyone at our table. Even Thomas, our waiter, seemed on edge. "The staff says this kind of thing happens sometimes," he admitted when we pressed him. "People say the hotel is haunted, but I've never seen anything myself." By dessert, the entire dining hall had grown quieter. The laughter and whispers had stopped, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Guests exchanged wary glances, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until the next morning that we decided to review the footage. Laura, ever the curious one, had brought along a camcorder to capture the evening's festivities. We huddled in our suite, the small screen glowing as the tape played back the night's events. First, it was just us laughing, toasting, enjoying our meal. The room looked as it had that night, warm, inviting, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights. But then, as the camera panned across the dining hall, something caught our attention. There, standing near the Christmas tree, was the faint outline of a boy. He was small, no older than 10, dressed in clothes that looked decades out of place. His face was pale, his eyes wide and sorrowful. He stood perfectly still, staring out at the room with an expression that sent a chill down my spine. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's him. That's the boy we heard." We rewound the tape, playing the scene over and over. Each time, the boy was there, clear as day, his spectral form blending seamlessly with the flickering shadows of the tree. None of us had seen him that night, but there he was, captured on tape, a ghostly presence that defied explanation. Determined to find answers, we approached the hotel staff later that morning. They listened with a mix of curiosity and apprehension as we described what we had seen. One of the older employees, a woman named Margaret, nodded knowingly. "You saw the Christmas boy," she said, her voice low. "The Christmas boy?" I asked, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Margaret nodded. "He's been part of the Crescent's legend for decades. They say he was the son of a maid who worked here in the 1920s. He loved Christmas, always helping his mother decorate the tree. But one winter, he fell ill, pneumonia, they think. He passed away in the middle of the season, and his mother never recovered from the loss." She paused, her eyes distant. "Guests and staff have reported seeing him ever since, always near the Christmas tree, as if he's still waiting for his mother to join him." The story left us shaken, the weight of the boy's tragedy settling over us like a heavy snow as we packed up to leave the Crescent. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been part of something larger, a fleeting encounter with the past, a moment where the veil between worlds had lifted just enough for us to see. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced that night. The laughter, the whispers, the ghostly figure captured on tape, all of it defied logic, leaving behind more questions than answers. But every Christmas, when I see a tree twinkling with lights and ornaments, I think of the boy in the Crescent Hotel. I hope, wherever he is, he's found peace. And maybe, just maybe, he still visits the Crescent every December, a silent guardian of the holiday spirit, watching over the tree that once brought him so much joy.